Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Long View. I'm Julian Zelizer. This is office hours. And as people sign in, let me just welcome everyone. As always, a favorite part of the week where we have conversation. Happy to take questions or even hear thoughts through the chat box. I don't know Don, that historian, but I will take a look afterwards at that. And let's see, any announcements? My foreign policy column will come out tomorrow, and it focuses on the history of efforts in the United States to achieve universal or near universal child care policy, which has now been in the news in New York. And I'm trying to give a backdrop to that. Hi, Michelle. So I hope people enjoy that. And my newsletter will be out for the long view, where I'm going to be. I had reviewed, hi, Don, Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson's book on abundance when it came out in the New Republic. And I just wrote, based on reading a new op ed in the Times about this theme, my thoughts on the abundance kind of argument. Not all of it, but in particular, what kind of political impact they anticipate. And I raise a lot of questions from history about whether they are right or kind of not really addressing what they think they are. Anyway, you'll see it on my newsletter. And later this week, I have scheduled thus far the Then and Now with John, and Charlie Sykes will be joining me, and we'll see if I put on anyone else. I hope you enjoyed last week. My various conversations, including with Jonathan Cohn and Peter Baker of the New York Times. So anyway, here I am. Please send in thoughts or questions through the chat so that I can address them. The benefits of Substack office hours, and I'm happy. I'm happy to. A lot to talk about, from continued debates over the attacks on the boats that have been taking place. Right now, the Supreme Court is hearing an extraordinarily important case about agency autonomy and efforts to limit it by the administration. This gets back to yes, Robert, I will bring John back, and we'll continue our conversations with unitary executive theory. I think the issue at the heart of this case about the breadth of power for a president to fire any agency head, even when stipulated that they cannot, gets right to the heart of a lot of what we have been discussing. I just saw in the news Justice Sotomayor had some very strong words against what the administration is doing, but that 6-3 majority of all the issues, this is one where a lot of that majority has been pretty lockstep, not just during the Trump presidency, but in their own history of supporting this kind of sweeping executive power. And this would essentially overturn what the court had decided back during the New Deal, when FDR actually tried to get rid of someone in the FTC, a famous case. And here we are many decades later, and we will see. But I suspect there is a strong likelihood the court might go along with this. But that said, I don't know. But we will see. The implications are broad. Look, this is the kind of case some people might not be following, but you are significantly ramping up the ability of a president, Marina, to have total control over agencies, including agencies where very deliberately Congress wanted to um, wanted to have some kind of autonomy. Look, you can think of certain agencies where this is kind of obvious. Thank you. For example, Penny, thank you. For Penny Lane, thank you. For example, the most pertinent is obviously the Federal Reserve. And there are reasons that autonomy has been structured around this agency because of the dangers of what all presidents have wanted in both parties, to have much stronger control over the Fed. for natural reasons. You can help win re-election. You can do things which are not good for the economy, but are good for your own power or good for the power of your party. And so Congress structures an agency with some autonomy. Not everyone can be hired or fired at the will. And over time, this was very important. There's also agency autonomy so that certain areas of policy, um, yes, of course, David. Certain areas of policy, there can be room for non political deliberation and guidance and policy making without the strong arm of the president around that. And so, what's at stake in this case right now is to end that. And basically, if you imagine the executive branch and the president in the Oval Office, this would grant the president near total control over every element of this executive branch, and that's the implication. So we would not have not only agencies at all with any kind of autonomy, but really curtail further the ability of Congress to dictate that through the way that they design these agencies. So it's a huge case, and I urge people to follow it. The unitary, right, Robert, that is true. Again, it's what I said in that the Fed is the most dramatic, and I think what happens in politics often is there are certain kind of issues or examples where people have an ability to understand the implications of something, and often politicians will steer away from that. I think with the Fed, that is true, and that's why there might be a carve out. Also, a lot of the business community, including his supporters, um, understand these risks and don't want these risks. But even if that carve out happens, I think this would be, given the case, a very big change. Marina and I think Dan asked, how could SCOTUS justify it? And we've talked about this earlier. This idea of a unitary executive has really been developing for a long time. People date it to different periods, but certainly by the early 1980s, you could see that young just lawyers in DOJ under Attorney General Edwin Meese were developing this idea. And some of it, interestingly, emerged around a law in 1978. In the aftermath of Watergate, Congress created an independent prosecutor. And it was a whole idea as a prosecutor who would be pretty kind of free to do what they needed to do or wanted to do after the attorney general appointed them if there was evidence of executive branch corruption. And the whole idea was to avoid what had happened under President Nixon, the Saturday Night Massacre, where Nixon fired the special prosecutor investigating Watergate. And so if you look at the early literature, it really revolves around that. And a lot of conservatives at the time didn't like that law, and they argued that the special prosecutor, the independent prosecutor, would not be, and this actually takes hold in the Federalist Society, by the way, that they would not be accountable to anyone. And one of the first big cases you see them investigate is Ronald Reagan and Iran-Contra. A lot of activists are writing that the president really should have authority to fire and hire who they want, more important, fire. And over time, you get bipartisan support for getting rid of that law. After Clinton is impeached in 1999, Congress allows it to expire. But the idea of the unitary executive keeps gaining strength in conservative circles. In the Federalist Society, Robert, is where really a lot of these younger lawyers, as they mature and develop, including John Roberts and Alito and others, start to really make this argument. And it still remains not fringe, but it's certainly not mainstream, because a lot of modern political history revolved around the idea of expanding an executive branch that could have agencies which could handle the functions of modern politics. And look, in the 19th century, the government was much smaller. By the mid 20th century, it's handling all sorts of complicated responsibilities. And part of the reason for the autonomy comes out of the civil service protections of the early 19th century. And then more of it also just comes from the idea that you need agencies to have this space to handle complicated ideas. And if they're always thinking about politics, you're going to have bad policy. Now, more than any president, even President Reagan, President Trump has put these ideas at the very top of his agenda. If you read Project 2025, some of you have, but for those who don't, this is really a key part of the framework. Just as important to the history is that a lot of those lawyers and Federalist Society associates from the 80s and 90s, some of them now sit on the Supreme Court. Many of them sit on the federal bench. And so it's a convergence of two things. And we've already seen an expansion of how the executive branch is conceiving of itself and how the courts are conceiving of the executive branch. But this case, it will just spell it out very clearly. So that's where it comes from. It does deal with the separation of powers, even though it's just about the president within the executive branch, because Congress has stipulated that some of these agencies were to have that kind of autonomy. And so it actually deals with that as well. And it would be kind of the erosion of one more check. Robert, I don't know. I think Robert raises a question which I've kept coming back to and being interested in, meaning the Republican coalition, yes, it's increasingly become more about conservative populism and the MAGA base, but business is still a hugely important part of the Republican coalition. It's an important part of President Trump's administration. You can just look at some of the key figures like Howard Lutnick, the Secretary of Commerce, people from business, the world of finance. And so there's this ongoing question, kind of where are the lines where business leaders start to break with the administration for self-interest as opposed to any kind of moral or ethical or even political argument. We've seen a little of this. We did see it in the initial kind of flurry of tariffs when it came out. There's been some behind the scenes, I know, on some of these, but thus far, the business has not had that much pushback. It would be interesting if there is a carve out for the Fed, because that's very explicitly not something President Trump seems to want, but the business community is very leery about that. Do they react on other issues? They haven't really reacted on some of the deportation issues. They have generally remained quiet and pliant, and very much, some would say, obsequious, as was evident in the inauguration. But we will see. We will see. I understand the trend lines, but I also understand that historically, when businesses feel that their interests are truly threatened, they don't really care who is in office, and they will mobilize in different ways. But we'll see. And this could be a threat because some agency autonomy can be important. Although there's also areas in which some of the business community is more comfortable if a president can essentially circumvent what independent agency leaders are doing on the regulatory front with environmental regulations, with workplace regulations, and more. This is a battle. It's part of this unitary executive theory. It also dates back to the 70s. The 70s, after the 60s legislative changes that take place, civil rights, Great Society, the federal education programs, Medicare, and more. In the 70s, a lot of liberalism, this is a kind of backdrop, focuses on regulatory policy. It's a really vibrant period where you have an expansion within the executive branch of regulations, particularly on workplace issues, like the OSHA laws that protect workers and insist on current standards. You have regulatory changes that vastly expand environmental protections. And you even have changes within regulations where citizen groups get more input into what is going on. So part of this, it's not simply a theoretical argument, I think. This is my take, a theoretical argument that conservatives are upset with the idea that agencies should have some autonomy. Part of it goes back to this 1970s period. I really believe that. In that it is an attempt to diminish the ability of some of these agencies to implement, to enforce, and to enact the kinds of programs that have been coming out of regulatory bodies as opposed to legislative bodies. Is the business community separated between huge international companies and American based business? I think those separations, that's a very astute point, Lynn. I do think, we tend to talk, and I just spoke about it, so guilty as charged in that it's a mistake, I believe, to talk about the business community, the finance community. There's all kinds of fissures within that, even within American based business. It's not as if everyone is on the same page and interests are very different. But I do think in our modern kind of global economy, there are some tensions emerging between very globally oriented and structured businesses and what are their political interests in the United States versus businesses that are primarily located. And these are tensions that have also been playing out really since the 1990s as some of these divisions become more severe. There's also divisions within both business communities from industries that rely on heavy labor force, often coming out of immigrant groups and the movement of people, versus those that are more tech based and rely on a very different kind of argument. I saw a little earlier note on the ships, and I do think. I mean, three things to the question. I can't remember the exact wording of the question. First, I do think there are some Republican tensions, at least, emerging over the shooting of the warships, and you saw vocally some expression of Republicans who are unhappy and concerned, not all, but some, about this second strike that happened that killed the survivors of a first strike. Where there's been calls for more investigation and criticism of Secretary of War Pete Hegseth. I do think some of the debate and focus on that particular incident on September 2nd, where two people were killed in a second strike, has detracted attention from a much bigger issue of the legality of the strikes altogether. Again, it's the argument that the administration is making is premised on the idea that drug trafficking, and again, even the who's on the boat, it's unclear, but that drug trafficking is a national security threat, which I think most agree is quite a stretch of defining why you would have military strikes on international water. Historically, certainly since the mid 1980s, that's when you have a lot of change happen during President Reagan's war on drugs. This is when the Coast Guard, U.S. Coast Guard, takes a much more interventionist stance on trying to capture boats that are transporting narcotics. But as I talked about with John on then and now, there was a very kind of different process then than what we are seeing. The process was an intelligence gathering process to make sure that there was evidence about the ships and who was on them and what they were carrying. Then the U.S. Coast Guard would intercede to stop the ships, but the way they stopped them was either oral or visible warnings to stop the boats and to allow Coast Guards to go on and search. And once the boat stopped, or After the late 1990s, the U.S. Coast Guard did start working with sharpshooters. And I think it was in 99. And the sharpshooters, though, were not shooting at the people on the boat. They were disabling the engines because some of the cartels were using very fast new technology, new kinds of engines. And then once the boat was disabled or once it stopped, the U.S. Coast Guard would go on to the ship. They would arrest those on board, send them either to their home country or to the U.S. for prosecution, and obviously also search on board for narcotics. That's not what any of this is about. This is just direct strikes where it's unclear what the evidence is for the strikes, nor is it clear if it's a drug trafficking issue, why the military is just blowing up the boats altogether. So I think that's really the big question. We haven't really heard much of this for sure from Republicans. And thirdly, the reason it's important, which gets back to the discussion on the Supreme Court, this is a vast expansion of executive war power, which is something that we have talked about before. You are granting, if this is allowed and authorized and supported, the ability of the president to quite liberally issue lethal strikes against kind of unsubstantiated claims on who is being struck at, but also using military force in a situation where we are not actually at war and where there isn't an immediate national security threat. So, both parts of our conversation today in office hours get back to where we have been focused for much of office hours, frankly, in the last few months. And it is, where does the US stand on presidential power? And how much of an expansion is the United States willing to accept, are voters willing to accept, in terms of the autonomy that the executive branch has? Chuck, where is Congress? I think there are many critics, Chuck, who agree Congress has not just been silent, and that is one way in which we can think of it, but either you can think of Congress actively supporting what is happening now by doing nothing. I tend to think of it that way because I worry that when we say Congress is doing nothing or Congress is impotent, that in fact the culpability of the majority um, vanishes. But Congress, again, has lots of authority. So the question is, do they want to use the authority, not whether they have it? And so what you are seeing for sure is a congressional majority in the House and Senate. And I don't think it's Congress. I do think we need to talk about who has power. The Republicans, they are accepting what the president is currently engaged in. They are endorsing it for either political or policy reasons. And there are a few areas in which I think you see the delegation of that power. But generally, they have budget power, they have oversight power, they have impeachment power, but they don't want to use it. And I think many Republicans are comfortable. Andrea, how can it be stopped? Look, you have one pathway is the courts, but we don't kind of think watching the Supreme Court that's going to happen. A second is what Notes from Underground thinks. I think I can't follow all the conversation, but in terms of if there is a political threat, a serious political threat to Republican power, you can see some support erode. And this is in a normal presidency, meaning a normal presidential cycle. This is the period that you start to see some of that in a lame duck presidency as the midterms come. But finally, and I know someone said this, votes. Voters have the power to vote in a different kind of majority. They ultimately have the power to vote in a different kind of president who will still, given the history, embrace presidential power, but a president who has more respect for guardrails and a Congress that has more respect not only for the Constitution, but for its own institutional prerogatives, roles, and responsibilities, none of which right now is front and center. Before I take a few final questions, let me thank everyone for joining. All of the subscribers to the Long View are just fantastic. Your support means everything. This has been a really rewarding project this year to engage in. And I do hope some of you might consider right now hitting that paid subscriber upgrade because that is what supports us. Independent journalism, if you want it, if you enjoy it, needs paid subscribers because we are operating on our own. And it's also, and I mean this, a gift. I hope people think of giving in the holiday season, especially to either younger high school and college students who might be interested in history and politics in a more thoughtful way, or some retirees as well, who I know I've heard from a lot of them who really seem to enjoy having access to this kind of conversation as opposed to some of what you might see uh, elsewhere, which is not quite as satisfying all the time. I feel the same frustration. So, paid subscribers, thank you so much for considering doing that. Anyway, I can take a couple more questions before I wrap up. I'm actually going to film a documentary, so I need to get going. The cat. Look, presidential immunity, that was a huge decision uh, early on before the administration started. I'm not sure everyone understood the implications. It was very broad immunity. Um, that the president was given if they were taking actions that connected to the presidency, which is a pretty broad interpretation of essentially how a president can be insulated from what they are doing. And I really believe that that decision set, Cat, a foundation for a lot of what we are seeing right now. When the courts give a president, the Supreme Court gives the president that kind of autonomy and that kind of leeway in defining kind of where they can do something that can be justified as a presidential action, you get into dangerous territory. And so, if you have a president who is willing to test that and to see how far they are going, and I don't think, and this is true of President Trump, um, kind of feels a level of safety to do a lot. And this is something different about President Bush, I think, than many of the presidents we have seen, where executive power, again, it's not new. We've seen an expansion of this power. You can date it to Lincoln. You can date it to Teddy Roosevelt. You can certainly date it to Franklin Roosevelt. But all the presidents in this period, and they were flawed, and many did certainly bad things. I think I don't need to go over Richard Nixon again. But oh, thank you, Barbara. And I do think I wrote an article for those who are interested. I know I'm moving back and forth, Barbara. For those who are interested, I wrote an article. I edited a book years ago in my series on the presidency, on George W. Bush's presidency. And I have an article in there. I think it's how conservatives came to love presidential power. I can't remember the exact name, but it's about that. It's Nixon's really a turning point, I think, both in terms of his use of power, in terms of what will happen in the regulatory world afterwards, and then in terms of this 80s judicial network that grows in reaction to the Watergate reforms that supports this theory. And so it's literally a long view kind of argument if you want to understand where this all came from. But that presidential immunity decision, even within this history, was quite important. And what I was going to say is, even as executive power has expanded, and again, we've seen many bad developments. I do think what's become clear in recent years is the informal norms really mattered, and some sense of guardrails, even as imperial as presidential power became, was different than when you had a president willing to jettison those. And that's the kind of conversation we are having now, and I'm sure we will come back to it. In any case, um, uh, thanks, Lynn. Thanks for joining me on Office Hours. I'll be back next week. Take a look tomorrow for my newsletter, for my foreign policy column, for interviews later this week. and I'll be in touch. And thanks everyone for the nice birthday wishes this weekend. I appreciated all of that. Okay, bye bye. Talk soon.